At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Hello, I've got a real treat of an interview for you today. And what I love about this podcast is how with every guest I speak to, we end up venturing and branching out into conversations and ideas I've never imagined before. It's what makes it so exciting for me to sit down and talk with each and every person I meet with, and no one has had anything like the same story to tell. They've all got me thinking and wondering about trees and life in brand new ways. And that leads me perfectly onto today's episode, and a conversation that has continued to leave a big impression on me since I returned home from Fiji this summer. I'm still unpacking the many thoughts it has left me with, and it's great now that I can share it with you. Simione Sevudredre is founder of Sawaka Culture Consultancy and is Fiji's most well-known advocate when it comes to protection and maintaining awareness around Fiji's indigenous intangible heritage, which he'll tell us a bit more about in just a minute. As a conduit between old and new ways of living in the South Pacific, and with a strong interest in global affairs, he's adamant the most sustainable solutions to the world's problems are rooted in a better appreciation for the more traditional lived values we all seem to have temporarily strayed from. Hi Simione, and welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. It's a real pleasure to meet with you. I'm humbled to spend some time with you. I've heard a lot about you in my short time in Fiji, and I have a few questions for you. The first one of those being, what do trees mean to you?
What do trees mean to me? Before I go into the trees, my response, because I belong to a network, a large notion of family, of society. When we say my, we are essentially not communicating our individual, but we represent the collective. From an indigenous point of view, when the question is phrased, what do trees mean to me? The me in this case is the collective me. When I say collective me, it means the family I belong to now and the family that is part of my history and genealogy. It is a family not only of human beings, it's also family of nature, our trees, our animals. You see, people talk about nature-based solutions, but long before that, we have nature-based identities. So what does a tree mean to me? From an indigenous perspective, trees, first and foremost, are our older siblings. Secondly, we have totem trees. When I say we, traditional family units and subunits all over Fiji each have a totem tree. There are totem trees that for some in Fiji, it represents a clan. For some, it represents the smaller subunits. What that means is tree is our identity. Long before our ancestors knew about botany and science and forestry, their framing of this was a subjective slash spiritual dimension. So a tree is actually our older sibling, and we are extensions of our trees. To hurt them is to hurt us. When we are hurt, when I say when you are hurt, when we are in conflict, the spirituality is such that our trees also face it. in some way the status of the tree, the environmental condition. So trees are our older siblings, and we, the bipeds, we are the two-legged version of our older sibling. And when I say older version, therein is our notion of custodianship when we mention the word totems. Our notion of conservation, our ancestors had already instilled over 3 millennia that we are here to look after our older siblings because our older siblings will look after us. And therein came the value of custodianship, guarding, protecting, safeguarding. That essentially is a summary of what trees mean at a collective level, at a cultural level, at a spiritual level.
Thank you so much. You've said so much there in such a concise and powerful way. And I think there's so much we could unpick from what you've just explained there. To me, it feels like the essence of what you've described is what has been lost in the world. And we're scratching around talking about all these issues that have appeared, and almost in a sense that that old thing that's gone now is not relevant, but it feels to me like it really is. And I guess just going into this a little bit further, I know that you work in the field of intangible heritage, and a lot of people listening to this might not have considered what that is or even heard of that term. So are you able to explain simply what intangible heritage means?
Intangible heritage, to use the illustration of the tree, if I were to use my own totem tree as an example, my totem tree is a candle nut tree. So the candle nut tree, like with any other tree, has its own physical properties. Those are the tangible aspects of it. Then there are the intangible aspects. My candle nut tree, it has nuts. In the nut is an oil. Those oils were used in the olden days for healing and exfoliation. The intangible aspect or application of that oil is I am to seek enlightenment and I am to be a source of enlightenment, which in today's world would be more understood as empowerment, education, seeking knowledge, imparting knowledge, knowledge that sheds light, and light also that dispels ignorance, which is also tied to the work that I do. It is an extension of my tree, the oil, the life-giving properties, the enlightenment slash empowerment aspects of it. That, in a nutshell, is beginning to understand the non-physical properties, the intangible aspects of our culture. And it's not only limited to trees, but for this topic, just limited to trees for now. So intangible is everything you do not see. And for us, when I mentioned initially the notion of totemism, that is an example of the intangible aspect of what we have from nature, our trees, our totem fishes, our totem insects, our totem root crops, etc. We see beyond, we value beyond the tangible. When you're talking about intangible, it's what you do not see, and it's also the inherent knowledge that's passed down over generation about this tangible aspect, be it a tree, be it whatever, but intangible is what you do not see.
With the commodification of trees and other living things and the land itself, it seems nowadays no permission is sought in the place I come from and the world I know for actions that might damage it irreparably sometimes. I know in Fiji there are challenges still to maintain that kind of reverence and protection of the land and what you still have. But at the same time, at least you still have that conversation. And I know that some communities do still stand by those old principles. And that idea of asking permission is a really interesting one. Maybe you can speak to that a little more for me.
On this mainland in Fiji, Vitilevu, in the middle of this island, there is a village called Navala. One can Google Navala and see it's the only village in Fiji that has kept the heritage of our traditional architecture. They do have contemporary houses, but they made a sort of an arrangement internal. The center of the village is to have the traditional architecture. Anything else that's modern contemporary must be outside the periphery. Once every 4 years, the poles, house poles, are renewed. The poles are made from an indigenous hardwood called vesi. Before the poles are renewed, there is a general inspection and there is a small kava ceremony where the blessings of the ancestors, the blessings of God are invoked before a tree is selected. So once the ceremony is over, the young men trek further inland about 2 miles where the forests are, and then they select the right tree. And the right tree to them meets certain visible, visual characteristics, which only they know because it's their jurisdiction, it's their custody. When the right tree is selected, then the young men ask permission from the tree if the tree could kindly give itself to become a house pole, house post. The asking is articulated or communicated through a chant the men folks sing. So they sing a chant which basically asks the tree, we are here from the clan, from our younger siblings. We are here to ask you to come, please hold up our house and shelter us. And if you could do so, and you give yourself kindly. When that is sung, they begin swinging the axes, and the tree yields itself. There have been instances where, after the men sing their chant, the tree refuses to yield. That's when the men recognize, oh, this is a male tree. Male spirit lives here. We need to go and ask the women to sing their chant. So the women's chant are different. The way they approach, the way they sing, the way they articulate their chant asks the male tree. And once that is sung, the men swing their axes again, and the tree willingly gives itself, yields itself without much of an effort. So the tree comes crashing down onto the earth. Mind you, this is a hardwood tree. It's very heavy. When it's on the horizontally, the men then sing another chant, and they basically ask the tree, now that you've been felled, would you please lighten yourself so that we may carry you home? And the carrying home is all done manually, over 2 miles, 3 miles. The chant is their intellectual property. Perhaps because they've kept the tradition intact, they still retain the chant, they still retain its supernatural, its spiritual affinities, which we understand it as mana. So the spiritual aspects of our trees in that story is a reminder of perhaps what we have lost here in Fiji. We've lost the spiritual. We've become focused on other priorities at the cost of our trees and land.
Yeah, and when you were describing that, my brain was saying to me, Tom, you should ask to hear the chant, but I'm conscious that could be a disrespectful thing to ask.
I do not know the chant from the Navala custodians, but there is a chant that is usually sung as a nursery rhyme to kids. And I grew up singing one of those chants. The kids of nowadays, they're into mobile phones. They've forgotten those chants. They have other chants that come from babysitting apps. As an example, there's a chant I learned similar to that. Bimbina seni do mama nakawongo. It's basically a one-liner which says, this tree is cumbersome. The tree will become manageable and lighter. The way it is chanted, when words are spoken, it has an influencing power, but the culture also maintains when it is sung, the power doubles. And the singing of the chant is, I'd like to use the word the Gregorian chant, something to that effect, where it's monotone, but it invokes this frequency, the spirituality. So that access to that power or mana is the last bastion is in Navala village in the province of Mba, here on mainland Viti. But the chant I shared is one that is now common, but the one specifically belonging to the custodians of Navala, that's the intellectual property, that's the indigenous knowledge. They will not share it. It's not because of commerce, it's sacred to them. When something is sacred, one does not profane it by opening it up everywhere. Knowledge here, there's open domains, there are closed domains. The chant I just chanted a few moments earlier has come into the open domain, but the old domain chants, they're still there with that village Navala. But for the rest of us, most of us, it has gone. We've forgotten it.
Yeah, I totally respect that. And I think in what can be dubbed in the Western world, the age of knowledge and information, I think there can be an expectation that all information and knowledge should be shared freely. But I think then that can corrode the sense of sacredness around certain practices and they become less meaningful. I grew up in the UK. It's where I spent most of my life. And one of the reflections I'm having in Fiji is trying to become aware of the, I guess, capitalist society upbringing that I have experienced, and my thoughts and concerns probably reflect that environment. And that capitalist system is not serving the world and its resources in a sustainable way at the moment. And that's part of my curiosity in Fiji, trying to understand a more sustainable method for living, what that looks like, and the role of sacredness within that as well. And one of the things that I have been really kind of privileged to experience is partaking in Sevu Sevu ceremonies with kava. And just to explain, and please correct me if I get this wrong, but in a simple sense, kava is a root of a plant, a sacred plant that has been ingested for thousands of years by Fijian people. And it is used in formal ceremonies, but also in communities as well. It has a relaxing effect, perhaps one that puts you at ease and allows you to talk a bit more freely without your brain kind of trying to control too much, and therefore it can open you up to listen more. And that to me is a good thing to have baked into a way of living, I think. And one of the things I've been curious about is actually how it can kind of slow the mind and the body down. But the capitalist world I'm from is about fast productivity, immediate gratification. For example, when I'm at home in the UK, sitting on my chair, I can use a phone, pressing a couple of buttons with my thumb, and food is ordered from a few miles away, food of another identity and nation, probably with ingredients from all over the world combined and then delivered using fossil fuel transport to my front door. And there it is. That just isn't sustainable. And I think there's something in moving, thinking, considering, taking action slower and with the permissions and such that you've described. Those are my reflections. Is there anything more you can sort of add to what I've just kind of shared with you there?
Colonialism has had a greater influence on our moving away, the paradigm shift from the collective spiritual, from collectively owned, to the individual, to the commodification, from the shared values to the individual, where the focus, the narrative changes from ours to mine. The old narrative and values, the guiding mantra was sort of like ours to share, ours to drink, ours to eat. When I say ours to eat, I've used three English words to try and define a single concept. It exists in our language, it doesn't exist in the English language, which, if we follow the theory of Edward Sapir and Wolff, social reality is built into the language. If the reality it doesn't exist, it will not be in the language in a single concept. So back again, hours to eat, in Fijian we say kengu. Hours to drink, there's a concept mengu. Hours to own, there's a singular pronoun nongu. It's not mine individually, it's mine as custody to share. So these are the values that when colonialism came, it came in two forms. First was Christianity, with due respect. But the Christianity that came, the values, it was cloaked in Victorian values because it came from England. And then later came the colonialism, the government. So they followed shortly after the other. So when this influence came, it supplanted these ancient values. The values of old saw trees and nature as family, as I said at the beginning. We do not exploit our family, both human and natural. But this view of seeing the nature, the river, tree, the fruits, our ancestors, they saw divinity in nature. And when divinity is seen, it created this value system called tambu. Tambu is also in the Oxford Dictionary. It's taboo, but it's connected with the notion of tambu and tapu in Tonga. What it means or signifies is prohibition, consecration, and sacredness. So when they see a tree or a river, the norm applies, tambu. I must not profane. I must not exploit. I must respect. I must show respect by being silent or keeping distance, and I must not pollute. This perspective, this spiritual, cultural dimension was subtly marginalized, and in came the commodification and the objectification of our older brothers and sisters, our trees, our rivers. Therein began our demise. Subtle, which explains why we have a lot, the word economics and growth are tied to exploiting. In the olden days, the words on economic, there was no such thing as economic growth. It was more a collective cultural growth. What do I mean by that? Our growth is ensured when nature is in harmony and balance. Our balance is ensured when we look after the river, the trees. We violate that, we are also violating ourselves. We are creating a future of uncertainty. This is our balance. We call it sautu. In Oriental cultures, they refer to it as karma, the yin and the yang. This is our indigenous version. But that old spirituality came under fire when Christianity came, because it out of misunderstanding, it was branded as pagan, and therein we were made to be ashamed of our values and deny a people their essence and their soul. Over time, they lose sense of themselves. That is practically where most of Fiji is. In terms of values, our values have changed, and therein is a spiritual understanding, cultural understanding on how, when we are talking about conservation, our notion of conservation is also tied to spirituality. Nature is not objects. We have nature identities, our totems, but the agent of socializing us into the new way of thinking as education, brought in by the missionaries and brought in by the colonizers. They've served us well, but at the cost of something else. I'm reminded by the words of Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. He said, if a tradition gathers strength over centuries, one does not turn it off in one night. That is a reminder not only to Fiji, but all other indigenous communities, because when I say we, the indigenous communities throughout the world, we are natural custodians, conservators of the earth, because we see the land as a mother. We do not violate mom. We do not violate our older brothers and sisters. In comes the newer way of thinking introduced, perhaps the right word is the introduced way of thinking, where mom and older siblings are now products, commodities. I tried to give just a basic understanding from inside the culture of where we began to lose ourselves.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple of specific questions to ask you. One of those is about NGOs. So we're recording this in Suva, Fiji's capital city, but also a place known as the NGO capital of the South Pacific.
Mm.
So what examples can you think of where actually NGOs working here has actually seen a tangible benefit to what's here already?
There's a saying, a lamp that is not burning cannot light another lamp. If an NGO, and to use the other notion, the illustration of fuel, if it doesn't run on indigenous fuel, bracket, spirituality, cultural sensitivity, if it runs on fossil fuel introduced notions, it'll just miss the discussions and the radar altogether. NGOs mean well, but if they are not attuned, sensitized, sensitive, the discussions will be misdirected from day one. I work with a few organizations like GIZ, and my culture consultancy accompanies these reps to the communities, where we begin to articulate and empower the community of this is how we look at land. So when you're talking in the climate relocation space, we revisit our notions of what are your totem trees. And I give an example. In one of the villages in the western part of Fiji, they were relocated because of landslide, because decades ago they allowed the planting of pine. Pine is a commodity. It's used for export. But in the process of bring the economics, they decimated the indigenous trees, their older brothers. And over time, they suffered with landslide. So they relocated. But no one asked a cultural question, because they were seeing from an objective, secular perspective. So going back, for NGOs to effectively work, they also need to be desensitized. If I may take another perspective, a more cultural / indigenous sensitive approach, decolonizing the mind, because what works here is unique here. Our lamps, our development lamps, if I may use that metaphor, They run on indigenous oil. They're not mass produced. They're nurtured with care. They're given to us by older brothers and sisters from our trees, from our leaves, and they're not wasted. So the discussions, the framing need to be concerned from that from the outset. Otherwise, there's no sustainability.
The incentives will change things if they're not in the right place from the beginning. You mentioned oil, and I know that the coconut tree is really important for one of the types of oil that is commonly used in Fiji for many different things. The coconut palm I see as quite a humble tree that's easy to overlook, and it's played a really significant role in South Pacific cultures, but many others around the world. Island nations in particular have survived over millennia. What might you say about the humble coconut and its place and its significance?
The metaphor, the adage that we use here in Fiji about the versatility of the coconut is vinaka vaka new. Reliable, durable, adaptable as a coconut palm, as a coconut. So for us here in Fiji, coconut, the fronds are used for basketry. They're woven green. When the leaves of the fronds are removed, the midrif of the frond becomes our brooms. When they're tied together, they make very excellent household brooms. The fruit is very versatile. From the young green coconut, the juice it containing within, we've heard stories how it was used as a first aid in the war fields in the Malaya campaign and the Solomon Islands campaign of World War II. The soldiers were away from the nearest medical facility. They use a coconut because it will sustain the solutes in it. The electrolytes were very much similar to what would be in a medical drip, for instance. For the word coconut, we have different words to denote different stages of maturity. Whereas we have the word coconut in the English language, we have descriptions like bo. That means a green coconut. It's just right for drinking. And then there's this nrokai, yet to reach that right condition. Then there's this soto. Soto is when it's over. It has peaked. When you drink a green coconut and it's soto, it's flat. It has lost its lemonade fizzy quality. And then there's vara, where you crack open the coconut and there's no juice left. Instead, there's a white, they say it's coconut apple, but we call it vara. This is where we derive the seedling and we propagate more coconuts. The flesh is grated and it gives our organic milk. That milk is part of our dishes, and when it's boiled, it becomes our base for coconut oil. And then scented flowers are added to it to give a scent for sandalwood, ylang ylang, etc. Oil is also used for healing massages. There are certain herbs that are added to coconut oil that give it like a talisman sort of as a charm to ward off negative vibes, negative energy. But it is gifted by elderly matriarchs or patriarchs whose role is healing. They're there in the healing arts. And the stem or the trunk, it is also used as little benches when the trunk is cut into sizable stumps. They become our chairs in the community. They're very versatile from young till when they're old. In fact, many of us, when you grow up, the moment we are born, our umbilical cord, once it falls off, moms and grandmothers look for the nearest coconut palm and they bury our umbilical cord near the coconut tree, or they actually plant a sprout, coconut sprout, making not only connecting us back to Mother Earth, but also planting in us literally and figuratively. May you be adaptable, versatile, and useful like the coconut. So the coconut has physical, spiritual, cultural properties. But when we're talking about coconuts, and when somebody is referred to you are good as a coconut or you are coconut, it is a compliment. Unlike in other cultures, one is deemed dense. Not us. Our coconuts have survived, provided for us over centuries. You take a coconut that's fallen off a tree and you throw it into the water, you put your foot down on it, it goes underwater, you remove your foot, it bobs up again. The coconut also tells us of our resilience. When we talk about resilience, we just need to look at our coconut. We draw from the coconut. When you talk about healing, we need to look at our coconut. Basically, the coconut, but it applies to all trees. Our notions of identity, of our resilience, and our adaptability. Our older brothers, our trees, our coconuts are there to tell us, hey, we're here. Don't forget us.
So, are you saying that with the conversation around mental health and well-being, trees actually have a significant role to play?
They have, I think, an intrinsic role. It's not basic because it has a lot of theology, a lot of psychology embedded into it. When I mentioned about our umbilical cords, it's the cognition, it's the motion, our ability, our socioeconomic, psychological, physiological, if we have to look for models, templates of who we are, our full potential, we just need to look to our trees, our indigenous trees. That includes a coconut. There are clans in Fiji, the coconut is their totem. But for other clans, other tribes, we just need to take our cue of what once was our indigenous notions of strength, durability, and resilience. They're still there. We just need to reframe and reconnect back with that.
One of the things I'm looking at closely in Fiji are where the oldest trees are and ensuring where possible that those are protected, in part because they are living beings that connect people here to their ancestors. They're trees that ancestors would have known, perhaps used, revered, seen as sacred elders in their social networks. I'm taking that idea about imposing capitalist ideals on objects or objectifying other living things and ourselves, as we've just talked a bit about. It's interesting for me to think about the oldest trees here and almost try to sort of manage myself. So am I kind of viewing a really old baka tree, for example, that is, you know, giving me this incredible sense of awe and reverence and genuinely making me feel really small and at the mercy of much bigger powers in the world? And yet at the same time, yeah, I'm thinking, am I trying to objectify and commodify this thing, this feeling? And what advice might you have for me as I explore the oldest trees here in keeping things real?
The oldest trees, unlike the ones you have in the redwood in California and the ones in New Zealand with the kauri, the notion of old is subjective here. It's relative. But there are indigenous proverbs that refer to trees as bulwarks, so the banya and the mbaka. There's a saying, "Wunimbaka nga sa tewor," but it signifies the grandeur, the majesty, and the sturdiness of the banya and the mbaka is what its purpose is. It tells of strength, inbuilt strength, adaptability. Then there is a fruit tree. The English word escapes me. We refer to it as ndawa. Some parts of Fiji refer to it as tawarau. The fruit is edible, and there's an adage of an euphemism that is used when one passes away. One has gone to the land of the tawarau. One has moved to the land of one's forefathers. And some of the early traditions of migration hint at forefathers coming in from Vanuatu. And the Ndawa tree, was endemic there before it was brought here thousands of years ago. So the memory of when we die, we go back to the land of our forefathers. It's frozen in that age. So and so has returned to the land of the Ndawa, Tawarau or the Tawarau, which is essentially from Vanuatu. And this has just been verified through archaeology, the Lapita pottery, the migration, and also the genetic gene tracing. We have old links in Vanuatu, but long before the science, it was understood in that manner, in an adage, in a proverbial saying. There is an old tree. It's in our myth. That tree was referred to as a sacred myrtle tree. The memory of it in the story positions it on our Olympus, Nakawanda, western part of Fiji. And that tree, the roots, is now empty. But the metaphor that the roots of the tree extend to a major chieftain under which I belong, the Ratu Meberata. The tree in a myth is referred to as a Wungayali. That is an old tree. That is old because it's in our myth of settling of Fiji. The Wungayali, the sacred myrtle that went missing.
Yeah.
A symbolism of about what the displacement, the moving out of from the Fijian Olympus to begin populating Fiji.
Wow. What a story.
Yes. I can look up the English name of the tree, but the writing it's spelled Vuga.
I love it. Mythical myrtle.
Yes.
You've spoken of a few metaphors, and I've got a question you might find challenging, maybe not. That is, with all the kind of problems in the world that we're facing or dealing with, managing, I wonder if there is a kind of metaphor you might share that describes how you view what is happening right now.
What is happening right now? There's quite a lot that's happening right now, but there is a metaphor that speaks about consequences. That always be mindful that decisions, choices, there are consequences. And this applied long before colonialism, and it's a universal value anyway. So the proverb that speaks to us about consequences is Dui Sevanga Nambua and the Tea. Each person will harvest their own frangipani tree, which essentially says cause and effect. Newton's third law of motion, action and reaction. So when things happen that run counter to our balance, it reminds us, that proverb reminds us the folly or our wisdom, that there are always consequences. And then Nandi Servanga Nambua and that there, each person, I think the English equivalent is you make your bed, you lie in it. So that's our, we use another tree, the good old indigenous frangipani, Mbua. Mbua, yeah. That begins to frame an understanding and notion of responsibility. So what is happening today, yes, I mentioned colonialism, but at the end of the day, who made the choice? That's for us to think about as low as indigenous people. Who made the decision that brought these consequences? And who can make the decisions to begin reversing and reclaiming? It puts the ball in our park. And it takes away all notion of complacency and notions of vulnerability. We have the agency and the capacity. It needs to be recognized, but it's inbuilt in the culture and it's there frozen in time in our proverbs. But I'm thankful for this podcast, for those who listen in the NGO space and civil societies, to begin to tap into our notions of indigenous realities, indigenous notions of resilience. Perhaps pay attention to proverbs. tale as old as time.
What would the ideal world look like to you, Simione, if we could change things for the better? What would that look like?
Think of our notion of better. For me, it's driving on a freeway where four cars go on one side and another four. We are still driving on one lane. Our diversity and our adaptability, that potential has been diminished because a particular way was brought in and we've been driving on that. For me, going forward, we can have that. We can build other roads, the indigenous, the cultural, and have a multi freeway road. That diversity, that blending in, that is easy blending in and out. That's diversity. That's tolerance. All the notions that are talked about at international levels. It is there. There are those who fear or say, if we let go of one, we can also, particularly today's notion of economics, we can have it and we can also have others. The guide to that is this notion of there's a right time, a right place, and a right space for everything. So going forward, I envisage an ideal world where we operate in two worlds, or three worlds, or four worlds at one go, and therein is diversity that needs to be acknowledged and is celebrated.
Thank you for sharing your time so graciously and your thoughts, your mind, and your insights. There's lots in what we've talked about that will stay with me actually as I continue to ask questions.
Naka, thank you very much. I wish you well too.
Just one more thing, if you may. Could you leave our listeners with one final thought or message?
For listeners my message with them is to understand what I mentioned before. Indigenous notion of family extends beyond our human family and also extends to our rivers and our trees and our birds and the values of spirituality that bind the custodianship on it. That in going forward, one may not come to Fiji, one may not be in touch with indigenous communities, but if we could all share the same value, one does not profane or exploit family. And in that respect, the earth is our family. Let us take that and begin to reflect on it. And hopefully, small changes will come looking back in order to move forward, as echoed by World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The further back one can look, the further forward one can see.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And see you next time.